They say bring your whole self to work, be authentic, be vulnerable. Others say only bring bits of yourself. And we see these messages everywhere when it comes to leadership specifically. Books, we got mediocre corporate trainings, executive coaching. We have LinkedIn always talking about self. Hell, we even see social media apps like YouTube, Insta, and somehow TikTok. They all play into these narratives about leadership. But truly, this is all kind of a false promise, right? Like, if leaders show up with vulnerability, they'll naturally build trust, create psychological safety, and unlock the elusive corporate innovation we're always hearing about. So let's get real for a moment. There's something wildly exhausting about performing leadership, and there are costs to using emotional armor all the time. So, from this lens of authenticity and vulnerable leadership, today, we're going to talk about how advice like this can ultimately backfire for many who try to apply this approach without understanding the systems for whom the strategy actually works for. So, welcome back to Burnout Meets Thriving, a podcast leading the workplace revolution we desperately need. We're your hosts, Farah and Miriam.
Hello, beautiful humans. So let's settle right into this topic of discussion that Farah did a wonderful intro for, which is something we actually keep seeing as consultants and coaches, and we mastered in this, right? Farah in industrial organizational psychology, I in organizational leadership. So it's very easy for us to see, and we want you to see it as well. So that same vulnerability advice that gets repeated and sold at scale. I'm looking at you, Brené Brown, and this is no shade, right? I read, and enjoy her work. It's probably one of the first books that I read on leadership that really spoke to me. But the more that you dive into it and the more you experience it and tie it to your own lived experience, this advice that builds credibility for some leaders can actually destroy careers for others. And that's what we're talking about today, the pattern. So the pattern that we can see clearly that we want to share with you is when a white-centric, white male executive shares a struggle. Here's an example. He's seen as authentic, relatable, humble, maybe even self-aware. But when a woman of color shares a struggle, she's seen as not ready, too emotional, immature, inappropriate, not the right time or place. There's an obvious double standard here, right? It's seen clear as day when you analyze the leadership in this country and how a more competent and skilled woman of color who was passed up for an incompetent moron who is wrecking the lives of millions. More of what Kamala had predicted in her running speeches has come true over the blatant lies that the orange one ran on and promised. The one is very clearly a liar and ran on false promises, and the other, who has actual background and experience in governance, most of that stuff is coming true, yet we're not calling that out on a mass level. There's, again, this obvious, clear double standard. And this is the trend that we see at work at large. White men are not as equally scrutinized as people of color and other groups like queer and marginalized folks. It's a very different experience. So this is the experience we're going to be talking about today. And it's why we continue, and I continue to say, bad leadership and the double standards that enable this assumption of power need to be called out. This isn't new. Marginalized leaders have been navigating this forever. What's new is that the leadership development is now actively encouraging vulnerability around this behavior without reckoning with who it's actually safe for.
That is so real and so true. And like an example that I thought of immediately was like if a Black woman is direct in the workplace, then she's seen as like aggressive or cold. But if like a white man is direct, then it's like he's stable. He knows exactly what he wants. He's really good at communicating his needs in the workplace, like double standards. So the real question we're tackling today is who is it really that actually gets to be vulnerable at work? And what happens when we treat authenticity as universally beneficial when the research shows time and time again that it's definitely not? So, yes, you guessed it. Today, we're naming inequality in leadership, not because well known thought leaders like Brene Brown or Adam Grant got it wrong, but because the entire leadership development industry has failed to acknowledge the differential risk from an intersectional perspective. So, no worries. We're here to show you how to discern nuance, which for some of y'all think critically. We're here to lift the veil on all of this and hopefully, in the end, diminish this facade in leadership.
Yeah, so let's get right into the trenches, our next segment. And, this is where we talk about our lived experience from the topic that we are discussing and the research. There's a huge aspect of how we lived it. And as a first generation Latina who is introverted, who falls on the ADHD spectrum, who's led teams across nonprofit and public sector spaces, I learned this the hard way and very early on. My vulnerability doesn't land the same way. Very often, I was actually seen as difficult by some bosses, or the introversion, or the way that I process slower or differently, or am very analytical, would be seen as extra. I think a huge aspect of the first generation experience is something that is hard to reconcile at work. And I often felt that ambition because this first gen experience makes a lot of people hustle and work hard so that we can make it, right? Like there's all the hoops, all the barriers, and we have to work what feels often like extra time to reach the basic floor of where most people are at. And by most people, I'm referencing in the workplace, which is white centric environment. Right. So like in terms of applying all of myself to reach the basic just foundation, I felt like my ambition a lot of the times, which was similar behavior to what other people were doing, felt like it would be ignored, dismissed, or seen as not ready, which was always very, very confusing to me. Right. So it's this double standard that if you don't have awareness, or if you're a young 20-year-old who barely graduated and is trying to climb the career ladder and is doing what quote you're supposed to be doing to get there, but behavior is assessed and evaluated differently, right? We'll have a future episode where we talk about performance evaluation. We've talked about it in the past, but it's felt very different. And often for me, this felt like whiplash or like a pendulum, right? Like it was so interesting when I would say things out loud, my ideas would get not listened to, maybe ignored, but then I heard a man. And this happened several times where men just kind of take your ideas or reiterate what you say. They say it louder, maybe. They say it more confidently. And all of a sudden, that takes off and it's their great idea. But you know for a fact, hey, I talked to you about that. And you're getting the credit for that. So this double standard is an example. And then another one is about behavior, right? Farah, you talked about it when Black woman is very direct. They can seem aggressive. Like women, we are seen as aggressive when we are too direct, or like that person is a bitch. Why is she a bitch and that man not a bitch? That man not a, can I say dick in this
Yeah.
podcast? They're a dick. But there's this double standard, right? And so, like, I've actually been called robotic for being serious or not showing emotion. And then when you actually show a level of vulnerability, then we get, you might want to put that away. You might not want to show too much of your vulnerability. So there's so much then, like, what am I doing? What do I do? How do I behave? Right? So it's a very confusing situation because you're observing these things that are supposed to be norms, but the norms are for who, right? Like that's the big question of this podcast episode is who is a norm for? And so here's what research actually shows. And I went off to study it through a master's and have read so much about it, right? So it's not just the experience that I've lived, but there's actual research on this. There's case studies, lots of books and articles. And in specific, we're going to talk about a researcher who did their dissertation on this. And it's Stephanie Osterdal Lopez. Shout out to you. If you get to hear this, I really appreciated reading your dissertation paper. And, she studied vulnerability in leadership. And she found what we're talking about now, that vulnerability gets perceived completely different based on who you are and where you work. Now, this seems like no duh, right? But there's a lot of experience and education and nuance and discernment that you have to get to know in order to really see, wait a minute, for women of color specifically, the research backs this up. We face compounded risks when we show vulnerability because of how racial and gender bias work together. So when we talk about compounding, it's like multiplying the situation. So what that means is that the risk I'm calculating, all the like discernment that I'm trying to do, isn't paranoia, it's accurate assessment of a real pattern. Something that I often feel felt was negative or that I was told to accept or to just keep trying. It just seems like you're never quite hitting the mark.
Yeah. I mean, all of the things we're discussing right now that we see in the workplace, we see in society every day. It's been a well-known fact among Black Americans for a few centuries now. And I'll say that again, a few centuries. That many messages about the workplace only apply to a specific demographic. You definitely have to look a certain way, especially when it comes to showing up authentically. Like it can even just be hairstyle, right? Like, don't even get me started on the differences in the workplace standards for wearing your hair naturally as a Black person versus hairstyles of other demographics. It's you know what? That's another episode. I digress.
It's reminding me, I did see someone did like a study where they used AI to change the color and hair of the applicant picture, and different results were gathered from exactly what you're talking about,
I
which is
remember
wild.
that.
So we'll see if we can find it and reference it. Um, so y'all can see there's a lot of proof that provides evidence to what we're talking about. Now I'm going to share about the invisible costs to this. So showing up at work, in meetings, and you're having to calculate, is this safe? How should I act? How should I perform? What should I do? Well, showing I don't know this confirm their suspicions about whether I belong here. So we're talking about imposter syndrome, right? With imposter syndrome, you're feeling like you're lucky to have gotten to where you are, that you may be found out as a fraud, right? It's a whole psychological phenomenon for imposter syndrome. So that calculation adds to it. Like, will I finally be caught today of being a fraud, right? There's a lot of cognitive load that's emotional labor. It's exhausting. It's how we end up burned out. It's a contributor to burnout as well. And leadership development tells us to dare to be vulnerable. And again, Brene Brown, as much as I appreciate the work that she puts out, I feel like there should be a caveat, right? Like dare to lead, dare to be vulnerable. The language of rumbling and getting in the arena, for those of you who have read her work, without acknowledging that daring carries different professional consequences, right? Like the same people are not going into the arena. And there needs to be additional consideration for how folks are rumbling and showing up with that vulnerability. And so what that means is that some folks are having to do extra work, constantly assessing risk that leaders with more privilege don't have to do. And that's bandwidth that you could actually be using to lead, to innovate, to do your work instead of having to expend all that energy on all this calculation just to ensure that you're doing fine at work. And this is a shared experience among people of color, women, LGBTQIA community. There's additional work and protection that we need to do. And there's something that needs to be said and acknowledged here. Not all leadership is experienced the same. So when we talk about these programs as consultants and coaches that Farah and I encounter and work with, there's ubiquitous, universal stuff without considering this nuance, So that may seem, again, like, no duh, Miriam, right? But I'm telling you that leadership and development programs out there don't always and very rarely acknowledge this nuance. So when I'm thinking through how to best respond, assess safety before I speak, so folks are not being inauthentic, they're being strategic in systems that penalize authenticity differently. So until leadership development reckons with this, asking someone to be vulnerable is asking them to absorb career costs that others don't have to calculate or experience or even consider, especially in predominantly white spaces. If you look at the stats, women of color are still nowhere near adequately represented in executive positions, leadership positions, and there's a large gap of other behavioral expenditures and emotional expenditures that are being, taken from this inequity at work.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Black women in leadership roles. Black women have been really kicked out of the workplace in general last year, well over 300,000. So the representation is getting less and less. But we always see like the story in which someone overcame all the obstacles, and so that makes it possible for you. Really, it's like kind of crazy how so many people of marginalized demographics have stories like this, right? Where they've kind of like got some retaliation because they were authentic or vulnerable in the workplace. Example, I once had a supervisor who persistently, I mean, every time we had a check in, they'd ask me to come to them for anything. they say anything, right? So when I was honest and vulnerable about like a situation I had with a client, I was faced with workplace retaliation, which is illegal, by the way. So if anybody is facing that, know that that is illegal, and your workplace cannot do that to you. But that's a story for another podcast, but more than likely a book. So
Get
let's
you a book out of that.
yeah, I'm getting me a book out of that. So what what I see systemically as an IO psychology practitioner, but lately I'm really leaning into the systems psychology of it all that feels better. I see patterns like this replicated everywhere I've ever worked, and I've worked in a lot of places. In a previous workplace, a corporate environment, of course, there was this new hire. They definitely fell within the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. Yes, I said all the letters. And they were not shy about it at all. So they went to HR. They chatted with me first, and I was like, I don't know. But they went to HR, who was definitely not your friend, about the problem they were having with the supervisor. And they were met with almost immediate workplace retaliation that ended up with them leaving the company. I know, like,
Wild.
it's wild. It's like the mechanisms used to measure and evaluate these patterns of retaliation against people of marginalized communities who show up authentic and are vulnerable. They're everywhere. We got so many performance evaluations all the way to 360 assessments from these corporations. We also have leadership competency models that all show a very clear bias and how identical behaviors get interpreted differently. So let's get a little bit into the research on rater bias. We have, decades of research on this. So here's the formula, just in case you guys are taking notes, because you guys are studious and smart. You're listening to us. So same behavior, different identity equals different evaluation. A white male leader showing up, let's say the emotion is passion. A passionate white male leader equals passionate. Authentic shows conviction, right? Like he's really into it. Also, another example, this comes to close. Somebody I got into, I wouldn't say an argument, but I challenged them on LinkedIn by this. We love that Steve Jobs or whatever wears jeans and a t-shirt every day. He's so down to earth. He's just like us. That's how it shows up physically, right? So let's say a Black woman is showing passionate emotion about what she's doing. She's seen as reactive, angry, unprofessional. She can't handle the pressure, which it's like, no, she's just showing the same emotions. You're just interpreting it differently because of biases, right? So let's break this down a little bit. This isn't about individual bad actors. This is about how our brains process leadership based on who we expect to see in these roles. Strangely enough, I even saw this when I was working as an artist, like a visual artist. Like people, first, because you have like a Picasso, right? I challenge you to think of a woman who's like been an established painter in history. So it shows up in real career consequences, even in art. You get your performance reviews in the corporate space, whether or not you're up for that promotion, those developmental opportunities that, I don't know, you need them to get that SHRM certification, right? Those sometimes go out of the door. And even I'm going to say it again, workplace retaliation, that PIP, it turns into something else. That could easily be seen as workplace retaliation. So let's call it what it is. It's a systemic failure. Many leadership development frameworks are built on this theory. It's to be authentic in your leadership style, show emotional intelligence, which is vague, in my opinion, and also practice psychological safety for who actually. There's a huge problem with this methodology, right? Like they assume that vulnerability operates in a neutral space. It does not. There's almost always programmed biases in all of us. Or maybe even they assume only certain people will always be in these leadership roles. Therefore, why reframe the context of leadership development? In reality, how vulnerability lands depends on org culture, who you are, and how others may perceive you in that space. There's this thing called implicit bias, and most people don't think they have it, and that is extremely dangerous. It's called implicit for a reason, right? Like,
Mhm.
all this truly means is that we're building leadership models on a false assumption and then acting like super surprised when they cause individual and organizational, because these measures hurt everyone in the long run. So, where we are failing ethically and where equity needs to be considered is betold in the research, as always. It's pretty clear. Leadership models that push vulnerability without addressing identity dynamics are asking minority leaders to do disproportionate emotional labor. Emotional labor is still labor, y'all. We're
Mhm.
telling people be authentic. Think Brene Brown's infamous courage and rumble work. It only works for a select few. She's saying all this while failing to create conditions where authenticity is equally safe, because that's very important. You don't want to get that retaliation. So let's chat about what's actually happening here. We're asking these marginalized leaders to subsidize organizational transformation with their own career risk. That's extraction, not development. That's emotional labor extraction. That's also, honestly, extraction of the individual from the system itself.
Yeah. Oof, that was a lot. That's a lot, especially from that systemic lens, which I appreciate and love so much, right? I think two things came up around one, the example that you talked about, the mass layoff of well over thousands of Black women, right? That we're not
300
necessarily 300,000. And we're
over.
not asking why. We're not asking, does anybody see this trend? Because there's an obvious why, right? But we're not acknowledging. And I think the other thing that comes up from what you just shared is the we don't see color aspect, right? Which is actually very damaging. When we don't see color, we don't see nuance, we treat folks as equal. But when you're not acknowledging that, you're actually, what's the word? Like you're actually like it's denial, right? Like you're denying someone's existence, someone's identity, and what makes them who they are. So, like these blanketed trainings or like blanketed mentorship advice from a mentor to folks with different backgrounds without acknowledging that, I think can be so dangerous. Like you talked about the implicit bias, but it can be so dangerous to not see color, to not see differences, and then to not actually do anything about those differences and operate with nuance, right? And it also makes me think of the ambition gap. Like, did you read that one? I think it's the Lean In network from Sheryl Sandberg, ex Facebook COO, who published an article that found, women are lacking ambition nowadays, but we're not necessarily asking why, right?
Yeah.
Like, women are in the workforce showing up more, but none of the other expectations of maintaining home life, all the emotional labor, organizing everything else, plus the job, that's not being acknowledged. But now we're looking at equality, right? Women and men are there, but we're not actually taking the background into consideration. And because women are actually more nuanced and intuitive in seeing this, maybe backing out from more responsibilities, and that's seen as ambition gap. They're lacking ambition. So now again, it's negatively spun around this, right? When we're not actually looking at the why, the background, what's a pattern, what's the trend. And this is why our podcast exists. So we're gonna dig a little more into the research here to give you more of what's studied out there. And that we're not just talking opinion here or lived experience, that this is actually research stuff that shows evidence of what we're talking about.
Yeah, let's get into the research. But also, I'm curious how she is defining ambition. If she's defining ambition as women should want to be CEOs
Yeah.
of Facebook, then she needs a reframe, and we all need to look at that
Mm-hmm.
article a little bit more critically.
Yeah.
But as we transition into the research, let's look at the big picture on psychological safety. I'm sure y'all have heard about it before because you guys are dedicated listeners. So, tons of meta analyses show that there are many different ways of looking at psychological safety. There are hundreds of studies that Fraser and colleagues in 2017, which it seems like a lot, but I would wager they could have found more because of how, I don't know, topical this is and how it's been over so many years in IO and also in organizational leadership. So, what they found in psychological safety is that it does not work for everyone, which is a big duh, right? Like, there's the cultural norms that you got to think about. There's a lot of different cultures in the United United States specifically. You need to be culturally competent as a leader, in my opinion. That should go into a leadership model. We're not talking about that today. There's organizational context. There's also like who you are. All of that shapes whether you actually feel safe in that environment. And that safety is what leads to the vulnerability and the authenticity. So these researchers concluded that without explicitly addressing diversity and equity, psychological safety is unequally available, especially for minority groups. A little bit of DEI goes a long way. So what does this actually mean? There's research that has existed for forever and that these leaders could be looking into, but they are not. Orgs think they're creating psychological safety because survey scores look good. Bad surveys most of the time. But here's what's probably happening. If you're not tracking demographic data like race, nationality, gender, even seniority within the company, because hierarchy matters in these spaces, unfortunately. What you're doing is you're measuring how comfortable the already comfortable people feel. Let's say white men who work there, they'll rate psychological safety as 8 or 9 because they can say whatever they want. They can be as direct as they need to be without any sort of retaliation. And let's say we got women of color. They might rate psychological safety within a 4 or 5 range. We add that together, we get a nice little average. You get a 6 or a 7. That's like baseline, like chill for most organizations. They're like, oh, 6 or 7? Actually, 7? 6, 7? We're doing just fine, right? We're doing just fine. And so what we really want to take away from this is that you can't fix what you're not measuring accurately. You can have a measure, but like, are you measuring what actually needs to be measured? Most organizations are not measuring accurately. It's actually a big problem. They're measuring ways that make them look good to the stakeholders, not the people who actually matter. I mean, yeah, we say employees are stakeholders, but like, does leadership consider them that? Do they treat them that way in the workplace? That's like a whole other thing. Right. So like if psychological safety isn't equally distributed, then asking everyone to be vulnerable isn't a neutral ask. It's definitely kind of loaded. Like for some people, it's kind of a low risk. For others, it's career limiting and emotionally sacrificial. There's so much emotional labor that goes into the rejection aspect, especially when you're showing up authentically and being asked to be vulnerable. So really when leadership says, we have psychological safety here, the question should be for whom exactly?
Oof. Every time. And so, okay, I'm going to chime in with the other study that we looked at for this discussion today. And it's, vulnerability in practice. And it's adding on to a lot of the systemic meta-analysis that Farah just talked about. And it's actually what I focused my master's research on, my capstone project. And it was titled Who Safety Counts? Cultural Analysis of Psychological Safety in Leadership Practice. And it's the work that I do with my consulting practice in Thriving Human, because these are the patterns and trends that I saw very clearly, but we're often negated. That's not a big deal. Like I, with a very innate pattern recognition and ability to analyze a lot of information, would notice this. And for me, it's like writing on the wall that a lot of folks don't see. And so this is where when I would bring up questions that would like, why is this happening? Bosses and leadership don't like to hear that, right? They don't like to be they want to keep that
Status
hidden.
quo?
They want to keep that over there. Don't cause a ruckus. Don't rock the boat because we like that perform normalcy, right? And so more information about this Lopez study that I mentioned earlier. Lopez did her dissertation on exactly that question. How do leaders actually experience vulnerability at work? She talked to senior leaders across different sectors, education, healthcare, business. And what came out was very interesting. Vulnerability isn't this clean, simple thing. You don't turn it on and off very easily. It's more complicated and it's shaped by who you are. And what she found is that leaders described vulnerability as this constant negotiation, which is fascinating to me. You're managing emotional risk, you're managing how people see you, you're trying to make meaning of it all. The big finding from her research was that vulnerability gets perceived completely differently depending on your identity and your context. your social position, your power in the room, whether people see you as a threat. And we talked about the dark triad leadership in our last episode. All of that shapes how your vulnerability is perceived. So whether you are working with leaders and bosses who are equally as calculating, Machiavellianism, are we using folks as pawns? But some folks are calculating on that end, whereas some folks are calculating on I just need to maintain good behavior so that I can get my performance, increase or promotion, or the calculation is very different from one that is very manipulative to ensuring your own safety in the workplace. And so what that can look like is when a white male CEO says, I don't have all the answers, people hear humility and confidence, right? Ooh, they can own up to not knowing everything. Wow. When a woman of color says, or director in a similar position says the same thing, people start questioning her competence, Same words, totally different outcomes. Fascinating.
It is. It's fascinating, wild. We're seeing it everywhere all the time, At some point, you would think that we would address this issue as a collective, but maybe it just takes voices like ours getting it out there, you know what I'm saying? So from reading both of these papers, it's pretty clear that the stakes when it comes to showing up authentically and being vulnerable, these are not equal stakes. The cost is different for everyone. We got Lopez, who found that people from marginalized backgrounds face higher stakes when they're vulnerable. Let's give an example. You start crying at work. I can attest to being treated differently from a white woman who started crying at work versus me, a Black woman who shedded a single tear, right? So it's not just this might be uncomfortable kind of a thing. It's this could cost me credibility I can't afford to lose right now. And honestly, for many, they might even realize that this is at play. They don't know the game yet. They don't understand. Like you mentioned before, you got to learn the game if you're not indoctrinated into the game. You need a lot of emotional intelligence. You need awareness, not just self-awareness, but awareness of your environment. And also just the knowledge that this exists, which is what we're providing to you right now.
Yeah, it makes me think of the word that you said, indoctrinated, right? If you're not indoctrinated into what's expected, and I'm pulling back to my first gen experience, when you're first generation from an immigrant family, forced to assimilate, dual language, bilingual, having to code switch, having to do all that stuff. I'm influenced heavily by Kimberly Crenshaw is someone who their work in intersectionality I'm gonna point out as one of my favorite. And for anyone who loves intersectionality, wants to learn a little more about it. And we talked about if you're not indoctrinated into it, I mentioned in your 20s when you're just fresh out of not high school, fresh out of high school, college, whatever, in your first job, when you are learning to play the game, but no one's really telling you how to play the game. And the intersectionality aspect, I love how Kimberly talks about it. And she talks about when you hold multiple marginalized identities, they compound. So we talked about this earlier. So it's you're multiplying the risk or the potential outcomes when you are a Latina woman, when you are bilingual, when you are first generation from immigrant background. It's not just the race risks or gender risk. You're not taking this can impact it, Latiness can impact it, the womanness can impact it, the bilingual aspect. Some folks struggle with speaking English when they are first generation from immigrant family here. So they don't get treated singularly, they get compounded. So it stacks up even higher. And the practical implication is that organizations, people leaders, and workforce consultants need to stop treating vulnerability as a neutral leadership tool and start asking who pays a price when they use it, and is that price the same for everyone? So, Farah mentioned a lot retaliation. There's so many forms. Future episode on this is how retaliation actually plays out for existing and being differently. Especially for folks who are on that ADHD spectrum, the questioning things when you just want to understand. I just am asking why because I want to understand, but all of a sudden you're difficult, you get taken off of assignment, you get put in the corner. Why? Because you are asking questions of the boss who doesn't like to be asked, questions.
Yup.
So this is a good equity measure to look at, but unfortunately many places have gotten rid of that thanks to the orange buffoon. Now it's illegal for us to look at these diversity metrics. We can't look at how the experience of employees, where there is a lot of nuance and differences in background, even two people of the same identity can have wildly different experiences, right? And now it's almost illegal to look into that with organizations, which is wild to me.
Yeah, it is wild. I'm also thinking about that college student who like argued against her professor and something silly, something very like this is a fact. And she brought in like our president said that we can't talk about this anymore or whatever. And the campus turning point chapter did a whole like expose on it. Anyways, that professor got fired. But yeah, clearly we got some problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's what makes this more than just a practical problem. This is actually an ethical issue, right? The research frames it this way. We're asking people to take on disproportionate risk and calling it leadership development and telling them something is wrong with them when they do exactly what you tell them to do. Like these models can actually make existing inequalities worse by wrapping them up in this language of authenticity. Say you're having a bad day and you say, hey, I'm having a bad day. Depending on what you look like and who you are, that's going to be taken a specific way, right? It's kind of crazy when you really, really think about it. I encourage everybody to think very deeply about this. We're taking systems that already don't work for marginalized people and making them worse by asking those same people to be more vulnerable, as if there isn't any cost cognitively, emotionally, and career risk wise. So, the consequences, of course, Fraser's research shows that higher burnout rates occur in these environments. We have lower psychological safety, which is the antithesis of what this is supposed to do. And then we have reduced leadership effectiveness among underrepresented groups, which shows up over and over and over again. Honestly, productivity measures at these companies. The cycle just keeps going and going and going, going and going and going. We encourage vulnerability. It's not safe. People protect themselves. They put up those walls, those emotional walls. We're labeling them as not engaged, not ready. They're too cold. Why aren't they socializing with everybody without any accountability as to why this behavior is occurring in this space? So don't be fooled. There's absolutely an organizational cost to all of this. This is not just an individual thing. This weakens your whole organization over time. Stop thinking short term. We're thinking long term. Persistent identity-based inequalities, all they do is damage workforce cohesion. We want our teams to work well together. It hurts innovation, which is supposedly what all these organizations are striving for, right? And it also damages your bottom line. Think about attrition. Y'all are always thinking about attrition and payroll costs. It's going to affect you. So don't get us wrong. Together, we are not saying throw out vulnerability or psychological safety. Obviously, we talk about the importance of it all the time. We're saying they don't work explicitly, like without explicitly acknowledging the powers that exist or who faces bias in these environments and whether or not there are actual safeguards in place to prevent these things from happening. But if we use these tools correctly, they have the potential, when they're grounded in reality of differential risk. So we're talking about intersectionality here, discernment of how these tools are being implemented and the effects on the populations involved, this nuanced understanding of how like we all see color and it matters. And like the application of all this, because we could say all this all day long and not apply it. We see it all the time in the media. We got this program and then they don't apply it. And then they wonder, what went wrong?
Yeah. And dude, it's wild. Like, so much comes up, right? The not seeing color part is so interesting to me because in this episode, we're talking a lot about the implications on leadership and leadership training programs and leadership development programs. And the reason why is because your leader has a trickle down effect, right? Let's look at our country, look at what leadership in our country is doing on the trickle down. An example that I can think of is that I had a leader. I used to work in the homeless space in Los Angeles. This leader lived in Florida. They knew nothing about LA homelessness. I used to manage a program in South Central LA. Very different than Florida, right? I would often very much bring up the inequity in healthcare access that we needed to address. My program was a healthcare access program. My job was to create referral and access networks and essentially mechanisms from shelters to the healthcare system, which we know is pretty disenfranchised already, right? So, like, this population already has that much more they need to do to get basic needs met. This leader would often tell me homeless people are not any different than anyone else.
Oh,
And so that denial, right? I felt it in my skin and bones of like, you are negating the very nuance and differences that is very likely keeping these folks in their position, right? It's not without lack of trying. And so just to see and understand and why I want to check and we talk about these things of why leadership needs to be better and why we need to take into account our disciplines, right? Our disciplines exist for a reason. We are the ones looking at these patterns, researching these things, calling out the implications of it. Because then why? We end up with leaders who say homeless people are not any different and they create the exact same program that is keeping them in the gaps. I'm going to tell you this leader did not last there. She did end up being fired. Thank God. I left before that because I couldn't handle that, right? I couldn't handle that someone will so blatantly negate the experience of a large portion of people who there's a lot of data for. And I would bring up a lot of data because I'm very data driven. And for someone to just say, not any different and not consider any nuanced implications for that. And so, again, that's why our disciplines exist because we see these patterns, they're researched, and then there's solutions for them. But unfortunately, we don't have ubiquitous occupational psychologists across the workforce, which I think is highly needed. Every organization should have a resident or occupational psychologist that is either looking at your people or looking at your services, because we're very much talking about the leader in charge. But then that leader in charge has the implication to the programming, to the services, to the bottom line. And so that's why I will die on that fucking soapbox.
So, for you leaders out there, here's some things that you can do. Before you roll out vulnerability based leadership training, ask yourself, is our organization's culture intersectionally sound enough and ready for this? Because you're going to look at the gaps between what you say you value versus what is actually happening, because oftentimes they are not congruent. So talk to people across different identity groups. Look at how your organization has accepted or tolerated change, because those are two different things. Maybe they didn't enjoy the change and they didn't accept or tolerate. They just extinguished it right there. Make a spreadsheet. I know y'all love spreadsheets. But the hard truth here is that if your organization has a history of punishing people who speak up, adding vulnerability language will only amplify the harm to those people and, in the long term, the organization. So be smart, measure what actually matters. If you're doing a psychological safety survey, you have to record and analyze the demographic data points. I say that because I came across a psychological safety survey and this person was like, we recorded the demographic information, but they didn't analyze it in the results, which bothered me so much. Also, add qualitative methods beyond that one open-ended survey question that you have at the end of your survey. Utilize the power of interviews and have conversations with different groups or even different teams separately. Even that sense of diversity within like fields of study can be useful in this type of, measure. So here's a test for validating the results of your survey. I want you to pull up your last psychological safety survey. Can you tell me how the Black women on your team rated psychological safety versus the white men who took the survey? If not, you don't actually know if you have the psychological safety that you say you are shooting for. You only know what you wanted to confirm, which is a giant no-no in research. That's not what we do here. That's not what we do. So
confirmation bias?
We don't do that over here. So here's what you could do to improve. The next survey you put out, I want you to add demographic questions and commit to actually analyzing the differences, because it matters whether or not you want to make a change or not. If you want things to change, then you'll do the analyzing. So put real process in place here. What you're going to do is What happens when someone is vulnerable and punished for it? Make a note. Look at those exit interview questions, right? If there's an open door policy, that's not enough. I just shared a story about that. This is about having clear consequences for retaliation and real repair mechanisms for where problems arise within the organization, because it happens, because people are involved. Leaders, I want you guys to ask yourself right now, can someone report harm without fear? Is there a follow-up when they report this harm? And who gives the follow-up? Is there accountability for the person who harmed the other? There should be. Is there a system in place for this? Like policy-wise? Is it in the employee handbook? That solidifies it. So the bottom line here is that you need to build a safety net. And you need to have these accountability measures implemented in policy before all else, because a lot of things can go wrong. Don't. Make sure you're including people with different identities in this design so that we avoid harm in the long run. So when designing this, it's not just going to be you. It should be a team of people who do not look like you. This will make leaders a bit more accountable, right? Because you have your different perspectives involved in this. You're going to tie in that psychological safety equity to their evaluations. Start small, learn from that, and then scale up. That's what they tell us to do in business. Why aren't we doing it when it comes to measuring things like this, right? Really what we're doing is we are looking for patterns in the data. Who's speaking up in meetings? Who's being silenced in meetings? Whose opinions are being acknowledged in meetings? Whose emails are getting ignored? All of this matters. These are patterns that lead to whether or not you actually have the psychological safety that you talk about in your values and mission statement on your website.
So fascinating that you bring up the making sure that you're doing it with people who look different than you, right? The first thought that came to mind was the hiring practices of some places are very like the homogeneity, right? And the implicit bias that we talked about. I remember early on in mid-20s, one of my first jobs went onboarding and training folks. And so I saw who was coming into the organization. And this pattern recognition, right, that is very innate to me that I did not know was innate during that time 10 years ago. I saw directors very clearly hiring people that look like them. And you can see that trend, right? White director, white lady director hiring other white lady clinicians. And I would see that level of kind of like implicit bias. Do they know that they're hiring their mini-me's? Is that something that they're doing? For me as an outsider, I'm like, I wonder if they know that, or is it just that implicit bias where you just like and feel comfortable around what feels good to you, and that is like a mirror, right? Like that mirror aspect of you like the when things are mirrored to you, like there's a psychological negotiating thing around mirroring people, right? Which is fascinating. And it's always a question of like, do people even know that? But then as I started seeing those trends and, like I wanted to work in more diverse spaces because I never felt like I felt in those places. And when looking for jobs, would very often go to the websites to look at the board and leadership, right? Because
very important.
super. So young folks out there, if you're not doing this, put this in your research for jobs and organizations. Look at their leadership, look at their board. Is it all white? And that'll give you much insight into what you'll experience. I'll tell you that a lot of the more rewarding work that I experienced were in organizations that had Black people and people of color and women in their leadership teams and board members. This is just gatekept in academic silos that we know that this happens. And again, this is why our podcast exists, because we want to bleed that out. Like, it's researched, there's evidence for it, there's data for it, but it's gatekept in academic circles. And this is out there already, so that's why we're going to keep on talking about it, because it does have actual implications to the services and to the bottom line of the organization and the experience of employees. So for the experience of employees, I'm going to talk about like what individuals can do. You have all this information, what can you do? So I want to say give yourself permission, to first build awareness. It's not going to happen overnight where you build this awareness. Farah and I, we are well beyond in mid-career already. And we have also masters in this. And we also have like incredible pattern recognition that we are lending to you all. Farah, did this happen overnight for you?
No.
No, right? And probably a lot of therapy to make us feel like we're not crazy and seeing all things,
so many
right?
years of therapy, so many. Get therapy if you need it, y'all.
give yourself permission, get yourself the tools to build that awareness. It's not going to happen overnight. Start noticing things, start reflecting on, wait a minute, what's going on here? How does that make me feel? Try to process it and really look at it objectively as well. So look at your personal experience, but also objectively what could be going on. And practice and get good at that discernment, right? I think there's so much power in that discernment that we talk about. If you're calculating risk before being vulnerable, don't think about like you being fake, not like you're being inauthentic. I know that I struggle a lot with being inauthentic. But very often you have to be strategic around where you play what cards, right? Because very much, I think you mentioned the open door policy, the person who was like, bring something to me, and then you retaliated against. What? So like that's a being smart and strategic part, and it may feel uncomfortable with, you may feel inauthentic, you may feel like it's not true, you're lying, or you're holding something back. But I took a big sigh there, like a deep breath, because it's a game, right? Like we're not indoctrinated to this environment, people from marginalized backgrounds. Like the homogeneity is across the board, it's there, it's seen. And if you're a young, early professional just entering this, there's so much that you have to learn how to play, right? And so you don't owe your workplace your whole story. So like if there's questions, if people are wanting you to open up, be mindful and be okay with like, I don't want to talk about that and I just want to keep it business. And then you learn how to discern who it's okay to talk to, who it's not okay to talk to. You know, a lot of team-oriented spaces will want to share and have folks, you know, open up about experience and how are you doing here. But very much like I remember a lot of the surveys, kind of like you talked about, right? Organizations will do surveys. A lot of people hate surveys. Yeah. There's always they're gonna use this information against us. There's no trust with surveys, right? I even talked about
They're
that.
not anonymous.
Yeah. And it's just wild to me how organizations will spend a lot of money with consultants to create these culture climate surveys on a yearly basis, but then people are not honest. And we're talking exactly why there's inauthenticity, why people are not honest, because we get retaliated against. And so there is a level of self-preservation that we need to be aware of, right? So with this comes a reframe, right? I think there's so much power in reframing perspective, and that is that like strategic vulnerability isn't inauthentic. It's, you know, intelligent. It's especially when it can cost you your career or reputation. Knowing how much to share, when to share, with who to share, in what context is super important. I know that's really hard for folks, at least something that I learned on the autism spectrum, where like it's hard to lie. It feels like lying when you just say the as a matter of fact thing, right? And so for me, I felt like there's a learning of like I need to be careful about how much of the truth that I share, because then I get in trouble for it. Why do I get in trouble for sharing what I think, you know? It was always a very shocking experience to me of like, you're asking me a question, I answered honestly, you didn't like it, I shared too much, you didn't like it, and then I get in trouble for it. And so that to me then meant I keep my mouth shut, you know? And oftentimes, and that's when you get like the disengaged person, you're reserved, you're very quiet, you don't talk, you don't engage. Bro, when I do, I get in trouble. Like, I don't get rewarded. You know, you see the inequity. So knowing how to discern it and when to practice it, that's a big reframe that you can do with yourself. And this is another example. As I was like, we were drafting this episode, I was thinking a lot about Mad Men and older shows. I feel like I always have like media references from movies and TV shows. You know, it's really interesting when gay folks were not allowed to talk about their identity at work because yes, you would be taking off of assignments, right? So like that's your very blatant example of how identity can trigger personal cost at work, right? So I forgot who the character was, but there was a man, like you just had to keep it put away, you didn't share it, because as soon as someone knew, boom, you could get fired, you can get pulled from assignments, etc. And same thing with women. It baffles me that like women were not allowed to use the same bathroom. That's a women's bathroom over there, all the way in the corner, just like the matter of differences. And I feel like as we are backtracking all the DEI and how it's illegal to do diversity work now, almost, it's wanting to go back to that type of environment.
Yeah.
But when we look at that type of environment, let's look at who was ahead and who was leading things, right? And who was being kept down in, you know, workplaces. So all of that is Just as an example, because if what we're talking about is a little, too much, if you're early in your career and you haven't seen a lot of this is information for what you can look out for, right? So, like, that's the personal empowering part to know that it happens, it exists. And there's also mechanisms. I think Farah and I talk a lot about that self protection, self preservation. We're not always going to dismantle the system all at once. Like, it's going to require a lot of collaborative, collective power. And so part of what we do with these takeaways is like, how can you protect yourself, or what can you practice in these situations as well? So, information to empower yourself. We know from data that diversity at all levels, from gender, background, and neural processing, leads to better organizational performance. All of that is gate kept in case studies and journals. And so that's why we want to talk about it. And so, some questions to guide you to reflect. Here we go. Who else with my identities have been vulnerable here, and what happened to them? Maybe this is a point of connection, an opportunity to find a mentor or a new colleague. Does this organization protect people who speak the truth, or only say it values it? Are we walking the talk? That's a big one for me. Are you walking, or are you just talking? Are you following the words that you're saying? You mentioned, I think a couple of episodes ago, organizations put their values in their websites a lot of the times. Missions, values, philosophy, etc. Is it just on a website, or is it practice? And so, noticing that. I'm someone who likes to name the elephant in the room. I see the writing in the wall. And I'll tell you, depending on who was in the room, I received very different responses. Some bosses appreciated it, and others I got in trouble with. Pretty much like, bring that to me before you bring it up to the group, you know? So, are there actually processes for when things go wrong? Vera mentioned this one a lot on the system level, but on a personal level, you can experience it on the receiving end, right? Or is it just these promises? So, if you're consulting the handbook, but it doesn't answer your question, so you're often given a runaround, right? I often think that's purposeful to give you
Yes.
a non-answer. The same boss leader that said homeless people are not any different than anyone else. This was a new department, and for a year we operated without policies or procedures because we were a new
What?
department. We were going to develop our own department policies and procedures. But as you get to know that person, as you got to see what was happening, as things were happening, and we had no guiding policies, procedures, or principles, that means that she could tailor anything that happened to whatever she wanted. That's problematic. And so this is on a personal level what could be happening. So this is where you need to like develop your discernment flex muscle. Right? So like you can know what's happening and you don't feel like you're being isolated, targeted. You may actually be, those things may actually be happening. And now this is your validation to why it may be happening, right? So this is giving you the real data to make informed decisions about your risk and how to engage at work. For me, it took a lot of time, right? But as I saw all that information happening, I was like, I don't stand for this. And I ended up leaving because there was just so many not okay things that were happening. Earlier, you think, this is my job, I need to self preserve, I'm going to burn a bridge, right? I'm over here 10 years later telling you burn that bridge. That is toxic, that is harmful, and that is not okay. So take care of yourself, document patterns, find your people, others navigating similar dynamics. That's why our communities and we exist. So find us on LinkedIn, find us on YouTube, on Spotify, or on Instagram, and know that like we've gone through a lot of these situations that we talk about here. And know when it's worth staying and when leaving is a smarter choice. And remember that leaving may not be, I'm leaving tomorrow, I need to leave this week, right? There has to be strategy. And like you need to think kind of with common sense and what's going to happen and impacts for your own self-preservation. And, ultimately trust the process. Trust yourself and your intuition. Your assessment of safety is valid. Your gut, your body is telling you information. So if you're noticing those things, don't shush them, don't negate them. Listen to them and ask them, what are you trying to tell me? What is off here? Look, right now I'm talking about this, I'm getting chills. So something's coming up for me in terms of like this experience. You're not being paranoid. Look, my body's like, you're not being paranoid. Learn to trust your gut and your intuition.
The body definitely knows for sure. And honestly, what you said about her not having any like policies for your department makes me feel like that was on purpose. So there wasn't any documentation
Totally.
involved if anybody wanted to go like over her head about something that she was doing. That's definitely purposeful. Kind of like when I had a supervisor who always wanted to hop on a video call when she had something she wanted to say to me that was usually off cuff and awful.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be like, I would rather keep this in an email. So just like that purposefulness of avoiding documentation is very real. So we got to start pressing record on those videos with some of these people. Since I started off with red flag, let's get into some more red flags to recognize when things are not going to change. So organizations, they talk about psychological safety, but they punish people when there are mistakes instead of, handling it like an adult. They punish the person like a child. If there's an open door policy, but there's a pattern of retaliation when people actually use it, that's a giant red flag. I kind of have on red today. There's lots of DEIB language, but there's zero structural accountability. So there's really no one to report it to, but it's on our website. That's definitely a red flag. Really, what you want to look for is whether or not marginalized people can be vulnerable without addressing the power dynamics that make it unsafe. So they try to create this facade that we're very inclusive. We include everybody, vulnerability, etc. Nah. Do you see any people of color or Black people or Latino people on that executive board? It probably has a pretty homogenous culture, like Miriam said earlier. So how to notice when there is opportunity for these systems to shift. If someone makes a mistake and it's equal to someone else's, and they are, I don't want to say reprimanded, but treated in the same way, that's a green flag that there's room for change and development in this area. But if not, then you can't have psychological safety. And these are the rules. I didn't make them up. The research told us. So if there's rigid hierarchy and all decisions seem to flow one way, top down is a thing. When it comes to projects and products, there's a lot of collaboration happening. So maybe start the culture there, just a note. You can't have a structure that contradicts this language of vulnerability that you are pushing out into the public just to satisfy your shareholders. If you name the problem and nothing structurally changes, that's information for change leaders. So say you're a director of HR, you're bringing up this problem to an executive. If they are not open to it, or if they're open to it, you start applying these changes and they're like, no, you need to stop. That's information for you. So protect yourself. If this feedback about safety gets met with people just need to try harder, that's another sign, because it has nothing to do with people trying harder. If your career and your mental health matter more than fixing the systems that refuse to change, that's not good. You got to protect your mind and your body because it's all that you have. So sometimes always the strategic move is taking your talents somewhere safer, because it's possible. I actually have a client right now who did my method, my burnout reversal kit, empowered her to leave that extremely toxic environment. And now she's happy in a new job. Why? Because she had the talent. So sometimes you got to take a leap for your mental health.
Yeah. I love the examples, right? Because it reminds me of the example we had a listener chime in with us. Shout out to that listener during an interview. They let us know during an interview for a position that they were hiring for. They were asking a lot of the questions that we have talked about already in our earlier episodes, right? About culture, about turnover rates. And they noticed that the interview seemed to get uncomfortable and we're not providing direct answers. They just said they seemed to be uncomfortable when I was asking those questions. And honestly, to me, I'm like, they're telling on themselves. So she made it sound like it made her feel like she was problematic, or it made it feel like she was asking too many questions that she shouldn't have been asking. And I believe it makes you feel like, well, I'm not going to get the job. I fucked that shit up, right? But they're telling on themselves in a situation like that, right? So she said at the time, cool, I felt rejected. But looking back, I'm glad it didn't work out because they were problematic. Boom. Boom. They told on themselves, and that was information. And this is where I wish that a podcast like this existed for me, for us, when I was early career in my 20s, because I feel like a lot of this was experience, and then I always felt like I was flawed, But in these situations, when you learn to discern, you're they're telling on themselves if they don't to answer the questions that you're asking about that, because they are very important questions. So these are the examples, that person that you mentioned that did the work, ended up leaving the job, and hey, found a better job where she's actually happy. And this person who were like, I asked the questions and they were uncomfortable and oof, I missed a bullet. Like these are
Yeah.
the protect yourself things. The learning to discern and, knowing when to step up or step back because it's equally as important to know when to step back and be like, not today, not today. So in closing, I want to reiterate that when organizations talked about this ad nauseum almost, when organizations ask for vulnerability without measuring whose safety they're actually creating, they're extracting emotional labor from people who can least afford to give it. This is happening everywhere. Leadership development, organizational change, DI work that asks marginalized people to share their experience and full selves without any structural accountability. Once you ring that bell, it's hard to unring. So we want to be mindful about when we speak about certain things.
Yeah. And just to reiterate, we're not against authenticity or vulnerability. We're very here for it. We're just highlighting that these measures must be implemented with justice, care, and nuance for our culture and our society at large, because it is diverse, right? There are intersectional factors that we need to be thinking of when we do workplace design, period. This just cannot continue to be ignored. Equity and effectiveness, they are not in competition, although I have read some papers specifically by white people who say that equity is a zero-sum game, which that's a no.
Mm-hmm.
What they do, equity and effectiveness reinforce each other. We can have both. Why not? Whoever said we couldn't, they lied because they wanted to uphold the status quo. But we do have the structural work to make a change. And if you're a change maker at your organization and see a need for sustainable systemic organizational changes, feel free to reach out to me at burnoutsupportsociety.com and book a free discovery call to see how I can help you out.
And for leaders, measure, disaggregate, adjust. So we talked about collecting the data. Make sure that you are disaggregating the data and adjust. If you can't tell me whose safety you're creating, don't call it psychological safety and do better. Straight up, do better. For individuals, trust your assessment, trust your gut. You know what's safe for you. Your body is telling you information. And for all of us, let's keep naming this pattern until organizations respond with accountability and structure and not just words. So if you're an organization who is wanting to actually address these things within your org and you don't know how, reach out to me, thrivinghuman.life. I do consulting retainers, assessments, and essentially I can be an internal advisor, right, as well. Because these situations, if you're hitting it for this first time, or if you're a leader who, hey, something's off, I do have a revolving door, what's happening here, and you don't know what to do, you're not alone. That's why we exist. And that's actually what I specialize in, is working with leaders who want to create a better work environment for their organization. Organizational leadership is what I study, my jam, it's what I do. And personal coaching as well. So if you're a leader who doesn't know what to do with this stuff, or if you're someone who can't do much about it, but you want to be coached on the self-preservation aspect of things, the discernment aspect, if you need that sounding board, that guide, that's also something else I can do. In general, though, we have a community that you can engage with. And we're new, but you can find us on LinkedIn, Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. We also have a listener forum if you want to share a story, if you want to ask a question. You can tell us about your story and we will apply our master's discipline and help analyze it to see what was actually happening. And so there's a link in our description for you to do that. As always, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.